News of the Times. The mysterious Manchester murders. Welcome to News of the Times. In today's episode, we are in Manchester in 1905. The battered, gagged, and suspected outraged body of a 15-year-old boy has been found in a cellar in an abandoned house by a local rag and bone man looking for forgotten trinkets. The crime is utterly shocking, and at least initially, given the low economic status of the young lad, seemingly without motive. The boy's family are utterly distraught. He was a good, responsible lad. Within 18 months, in the same vicinity, in an abandoned house that is up for demolition, one of the demolition crew members is concerned about a terrible smell emanating from the cellar. We take a look at these two terrible crimes taking place in Manchester in 1905. And today's end of episode, further particular story, looks at another type of mystery from 1908, with a farmer and family astounded by observing various objects within their home regularly moving before them inexplicably. We hope that you enjoy the show. Background. Thomas Smith, 15 years of age, was described as a good lad. Although his family was poor, his aged mother worked as a charwoman and did laundry to eke out an existence, and the family were close. Thomas, as was usual at the time, worked to help to support his family. His role was in a local umbrella factory. Thomas was looking around for another suitable position as he complained of being teased by his fellow young lads within the factory due to a medical complaint that remained unspecified. With his mother's permission, Thomas took off 1 week from his usual job to go out in search of work. She believed when he did not come back home that he was staying with one of his sisters. With her multiple work duties and lack of telephone, she had little opportunity to check this for herself. 1 week after Thomas's cheerful goodbye to his mum, a rag and bone man, a mobile junk dealer, enters a derelict house hoping to find some forgotten treasures that he might be able to sell. Looking through a cellar window, he sees something lying on the floor, and going down the steps, he nearly trips over the body of young Thomas. From the Manchester Evening News, the 12th of April, 1905, a mysterious murder. Gruesome Manchester discovery. Boy's body found in a cellar. The dead body of a boy aged 15 was found yesterday afternoon in the cellar of an empty house on the borders of the Ancoats district, under circumstances which leave no room to doubt that a dreadful crime had been committed. The discovery was made by a rag and bone man named Dan Shields, who at about 3:15 went into the yard of the unoccupied house at 24 Hoyle Street, Fairfield Street, the door being open. As he stooped to pick up an old sack, he caught sight of an aperture in the wall of the back cellar. A wooden ventilator had fallen away, and on looking into the cellar, he saw a half-naked body lying partly under a slab. Shields immediately informed another rag and bone man named Harris, who was close by, and, accompanied by a policeman, they forced an entrance to the house, which has an unoccupied house on each side of it. Thomas's body had been horribly battered, and his clothing is dishevelled. Adding to the sense of horror is a newspaper comic that has been shoved in his mouth, then held in place with Thomas's own handkerchief. Gagged and murdered. There were no signs of life about the body, which was half stripped. A roll of paper was wedged like a gag into the mouth, over which a handkerchief was tightly bound. The paper was found to be part of a comic journal dated April the 8th of this year, and the handkerchief was red with a border of 7 black stripes. The head had been savagely battered, the skull being fractured. The neck, too, had suffered fearful injury, and the face was so smashed in as to be almost unrecognizable. Near the head was a brick stained with blood. The clothes on the corpse were cut and torn. As it was quite evident that the body was dead, the officer, Police Constable Robert Jackson, communicated at once with Inspector Whitehead and also sent for Dr. Heslop, Divisional Police Surgeon. The doctor thought that the death had occurred about 2 days earlier. The body was removed to Mill Street Mortuary in Bradford. Dr. Heslop was to make a post-mortem examination this morning. Later inquiries, however, suggested that the murder had occurred more recently than Sunday, possibly so lately as yesterday morning. Apparent absence of motive. There was nothing on the body to establish its identity. What appeared at first to be a valuable clue was a second-class ticket for the Mayfield swimming baths bearing the number 7837. But on inquiry at the baths, it was found that it was only a one-day permit, which had been purchased more than a week before, and the names of persons buying such tickets are not taken. The police had not had reported to them any missings of persons whose description tallied with that of the youth. There was no obvious motive for the crime. The poverty of the deceased's clothing precluded any supposition that it was prompted by robbery. It seems clear that the murder was actually committed in the cellar, but beyond the disarray of the clothing, no signs of a struggle were to be seen. Police activity. Superintendent Cordon, who is in charge of C Division, immediately set half a dozen men specially to work upon the case, which is one of the most mysterious that has ever engaged the attention of the Manchester police, and the cellar was photographed before the body was removed. The most diligent search is being made for information which may help to clear up the affair, and there is reason to suppose that the police have at their disposal some information which they do not at present wish to make public. But to the time of writing, no arrest had been effected. Mrs. Smith hears the terrible news as she's working in one of her jobs. Her employer reads the newspaper article aloud to her regarding the young lad's dead body found in the cellar of an abandoned house. She suspects it is her son, Tommy, right away. The body identified. The body of the dead lad was identified this morning as that of Thomas Smith of 18 Wood Street West, who left home a week ago yesterday and had not since been seen by his friends. The body was identified by the lad's mother. How the body was identified. This morning, Mrs. Smith, a widow of 18 Wood Street, who goes out charing and was washing at the house of her brother-in-law at Old Trafford when her sister's husband read the description of the deceased from one of the morning papers. Mrs. Smith's son, Thomas, a lad of 16, had been missing from home since last Tuesday morning, and she concluded that the victim of the foul murder was her boy. She at once got in communication with her son Isaac, a man of 30, who is a collier, and the pair, accompanied by 2 friends, paid a visit to the Mill Street Mortuary in Bradford. Both Mrs. Smith and Isaac were unable to identify features owing to his face having been so frightfully battered, but they recognized him by his cap, scarf, and shirt, and the little fellow's own muffler having been used to gag him. Both mother and son were greatly affected, the condition of the woman, who is bent with age, being very pathetic. A pathetic meeting. While Mrs. Smith and her son were at the mortuary, a son-in-law from Duckenfield, who had read an account of the murder in the morning papers and thought, like Mrs. Smith, that the victim was the boy Thomas, arrived at the house but was unable to gain admission. When he ascertained that his fears were well founded, he broke down completely. But on seeing Mrs. Smith and her son Isaac approaching in the street, he recovered his composure and went to meet them. The meeting was a pathetic one, the three people becoming completely unstrung. Interview with the mother. Mrs. Smith, who was almost prostrated with grief, said Tommy was a good lad. He left home a week yesterday morning, and I never saw him again alive. A week last Monday he asked me to let him stay away from work, and I allowed him to do so. On the following morning he left the house early, but did not take his dinner with him. I called him back, and he said he wouldn't be going to work until breakfast time. When he didn't return, I concluded that he had gone to see his married sister at Duncanfield, or another married sister at Denton. I made inquiries but found that he had not visited either place. My son Isaac has looked for him, and a few days ago he mentioned Tommy's disappearance to the police. He was very comfortable at home, but I know he was looking out for another situation. I never hear him say he was uncomfortable at work, but when he was employed at another place, he used to say that the lads teased him because of some affliction from which he was suffering. Police swarm onto the case with additional police brought in from other departments to buffer investigation. One immediate clue would seem to be the rumour of a man in the same general vicinity who had been approaching lads of around the same age with promises of a penny if they would go with him. Other abandoned houses are also searched to check for any other possible victims. From the Manchester Evening News, the 13th of April 1905, the Manchester murder. Mystery still unsolved. Extraordinary stories following up possible clues. The murder of the youth Thomas Smith in an empty house in Hoyle Street, which is nearer to Ardwick than to Ancoats, continues to occupy the undivided attention of a large staff of Manchester police. The uniformed men under Superintendent Cordon and the detectives under Superintendent Mackenzie are working night and day to try and unravel the mystery, which is one of the most difficult tasks that has ever presented itself to them. Their great difficulty is that so far they have not been able to discover anyone who saw the deceased on any of the few days immediately preceding the murder. They are making inquiries with a view to ascertaining if, during the past week, any roan accompanied by a youth answering the description of the deceased stayed at either of the lodging houses in the city, but as yet they have not met with any success. Decoying boys. Some importance is attached to certain information which has reached the police today. The murder was being discussed in a public house last night, and one of the company mentioned that one of his boys had had an unpleasant adventure in the neighbourhood of where the murder took place. The boy was sent an errand, and on the way he met a man who offered him a penny if he would go with him. The lad did so, but when near an empty house he remembered that he was told by his parents not to dally, and he left the man and went on his errand. He has given a good description of the stranger, who is now being looked for by the police. The searching of empty houses in the district is being proceeded with diligently, the police being determined to make sure that no other victims of foul play are undiscovered. They have not received any information which would lead them to suppose that any other murders had been committed, but in view of the fact that attempts have been made to decoy other lads into empty houses and gag them, they deem it of the greatest importance that a thorough search should be made. Despite energetic investigations by the police, no viable suspects are found. An initial inquest takes place a few days after the discovery of Thomas's body, but no real evidence is brought forward. Tommy's mother, utterly devastated and broken by the news of the murder of her son, gives evidence recounting the last time that she saw him. The follow-up inquest is held approximately 1 month from the last time Thomas was seen alive. The medical evidence is disturbing, and it is now suspected that Thomas had been interfered with, which would explain the state of his trousers. It is clear that Thomas put up a tremendous fight. From the Manchester Evening News, the 5th of May, 1905, the Ardwick murder, adjourned coroner's inquiry, the mystery still unsolved. The coroner's inquiry relative to the revolting murder in Hoyle Street in Ardwick was resumed by the city coroner today. It will be recalled that the victim was Thomas Smith, aged 16, who lived in Wood Street West, at a C&M, who was employed at an umbrella factory in Bridgewater Street. He went out on the morning of April 4th, and nothing was heard of him until his battered body was found 7 days later in a cellar at an empty house in Hoyle Street in Ardwick. It was discovered by a ragman who, in search of unconsidered trifles, saw the boy through an aperture in the yard. Ghastly injury. Dr. Heslop gave the result of his examination of the body both at the cellar and at the Fairfield Street mortuary. There was, he said, a red handkerchief with a black border over the mouth which had been tied around the neck and knotted on the face. Mrs. Smith, who had wept considerably, stated that the handkerchief belonged to her son. Continuing, the doctor said the clothing was torn and disarranged. The trousers were torn in front and pulled down at the back. His face and head were very much bruised, and there was blood coming from the nose and the ears. Although the head and scalp were beaten almost to a pulp, there was no absolute wound. He removed the gag from the mouth with difficulty. On making the post-mortem examination, he found there was a bruise about the size of a shilling near the corner of the left eye. Over the left cheek, one was about the size of half a crown, a wound over the nose, and another over the left ear. He also discovered a bruise apparently done by a boot near the thigh, and the nail on the middle finger of the left hand was completely torn off. There were scratches all over both hands, and he took that to be indications of a very severe struggle. Internally, there was an extensive fracture on the forehead, and death was due to the injuries to the head caused by external violence. The shocking medical testimony unveiled the extent of Tommy's injuries, leaving the court in silence, only broken but for the sobbing of his mother. It is with real regret and dismay that the jury is unable to pin the crime on any person. A terrible atrocity. In addressing the jury, the coroner remarked that a terrible and frantic struggle had taken place somewhere. That was shown by the many injuries on the body, and that the nail had been torn off. The boy had been evidently struggling hard to save himself, and at the end had been gagged and terribly assaulted. The head had been battered to pieces, and it had been suggested that this had been done by a brick. That, however, could hardly be so, seeing that no brick was only slightly stained. The whole surrounding circumstances, he continued, showed that somebody had deliberately made away with this boy with the utmost ferocity. The police were making inquiries. All they could hope for was that their efforts would be successful and that the perpetrator of this terrible atrocity would be found out and called upon to pay the penalty of his ghastly crime. The verdict. Without hesitation, the jury returned a verdict of willful murder against some person or persons unknown. Although police investigations persist, there are no visible leads and other stories and new crimes that take place, like the horrific find of Tommy's dishevelled, battered body in the cellar, until, roughly some 18 months later, another body is found of a young lad. A house marked for demolition is visited by one of the crew members who notices a terrible stench emitting from the cellar. There, the decomposing body of a 15-year-old Squire Kingston is found. The body is so decayed it falls apart as attempts are made to move it. From the Birmingham Mail, the 21st of November 1906, Manchester mystery. Boy's body found in cellar. A mysterious crime in Ancoats is occupying the attention of the Manchester police. Yesterday morning, a workman named William Hulse of Gregory Street went into a house in Chapel, a dismal thoroughfare behind London Reed Station. The house was to be demolished, and Hulse was one of the men engaged upon the work. For about a year, the premises had not been occupied, but as soon as he entered the ground floor rooms, Hulse felt that the stench which pervaded the place could not arise from mere dampness. The smell attracted him to the cellar, and descending, he stumbled and nearly fell over the body of the boy. He immediately gave information at the police office in London Road. Officers at once proceeded to the house, but when they attempted to lift the body, the head rolled away from the trunk the moment they touched it. Obviously, the corpse had lain for weeks in this seclusion. Only a little flesh remained, the body being so decomposed that it had to be removed to the mortuary in a bag. Around the neck still hung a small, thin strap. It was buckled and once might have been tight. Now it hung loose. Over one of the shoulders was a slab, and the head was partly under a slop stone. The body had evidently been without clothing, and in this fact the police believe they have a clue to the motive of the outrage. Later in the afternoon, the remains were identified as those of Squire Kingston, 15, whose mother lived until Whitsuntide at 7 Back Grey Street, and whose dwelling is now in Davis Street. The mother and widow, now with 4 children, stated that Squire had never been a particularly good lad. One night in August last, he stayed out all night, and the next day his mother met him in Butler Street in Ancoats. "You naughty boy," she said, "go right home and stay in the house," and she boxed his ears. But he didn't go home, and his mother never saw him again. Later on, she heard that her boy was with his cousin and concluded that he was staying at her sister's house. She did not go there because the 2 women were not on the best of friends, but she never doubted that Squire was safe and sound. The police investigations point to the conclusion that the boy had been murdered. The cellar is in a block of untenanted property that had been used by the lowest class of people. Unhappily, the body is in such an advanced state of decomposition that the post-mortem examination may not reveal the cause of death. The inquest will be held on Friday. The decayed state of the body means that it is very difficult to assess if this victim was also interfered with. Like the other previous case, there are few leads that police can use. From the Sheffield Daily Telegraph, the 23rd of November 1906, Manchester cellar murder. Further inquiries into the finding of the dead body of a boy in the cellar of a slum in Ancoats in Manchester strengthened the theory of the police that a murder had been committed under shocking conditions. A similar case, which was never cleared up, occupied in the same district 18 months ago. The examination of the body of Knighton established that his death was due to strangulation caused by the strap which was found loose around the neck of the skeleton. The looseness of the strap was probably due to the shrinkage of the flesh after death. No bones were broken. At the inquest on Friday, medical evidence stated that the cause of death could not be ascertained owing to the decomposition. The jury returned an open verdict. Both cases remained unresolved. Further particulars. Today's episode from 1908 in Connecticut recounts the inexplicable occurrence in a normal farmhouse. Objects around the home move themselves during the day and in front of strangers, causing real consternation. From the Great Bend Tribune, 28th of September 1908, spooky actions puzzle farmer. Marbles roll along the floor. Groton in Connecticut, this town is excited indeed over the amazing happenings at the fine old farm of William Hempstead, a mile east of New London. Visitors have been going out in automobiles and carriages to study the mystery. Small articles such as beans, spools of thread, knives, marbles, etc. have been moving about the house in broad daylight. Although the house is next to the Old Knowles family cemetery, the phenomena did not seem to be of the ghost or spook variety. The manifestations never take place at night. The house was built in the long ago, and it is 2 stories high, roomy, in good condition, and happily situated. The family consists of Mr. Hempstead, a refined and practical old gentleman of 70-odd years. He does not believe in spooks. His wife has no superstitions, and they have been married for 30 years and have lived in the old manse since their wedding. Having no children, they adopted 13 years ago the young son of Mrs. Hempstead's sister, Frankie Gardner, and gave him their name. The boy has a brother, Charles, who is about his own age, and there is employed on the farm Gilbert Edwards, a lad of 16, son of a neighbour, and 3 hired men. When these strange things first began to happen, said Mr. Hempstead the other day, I said nothing because I didn't want anyone to think that I was deluded. I was in the cornfield one day when a marble, such as the boys play with about the house, fell at my feet. Looking toward the house, I saw that a screen in the 2nd story had been pushed aside and a cloth was being waved from the window. Going to the house, I found that no one had been in that room where the cloth was waved. No one had thrown a marble, and the hired men were at work and the boys were out. I said nothing, but on Friday we discovered beans moving about the house in a most astonishing fashion. They were the same sort of beans as the ones we raised and have been laid out on the attic floor to dry. Of course, beans will sometimes dry in the pods and on a hot day will split open and bounce around, but I never saw any beans that could come down the attic stairs, move around the room, cut square corners and fall on the floor. There was a bean in the northeast room that came out of the north wall, sailed across the room, cut around the sewing machine, and after making several corners, fell on the floor. Naturally, we began to get nervous when marbles that the boys had not touched for months began to move about the house. They would come in at a door, move across the room, and stop. We made certain that it was not the work of the boys because these things happened when the boys were out of the house. For example, several old rusty keys that had been lost for years came bounding down the stairs from the attic into the rooms upstairs and were picked up. I made sure no one was in the attic. I've heard some of our visitors account for the things by electricity. We have a telephone, and the wire runs half around the house and in at the dining room window, but I never heard that a telephone wire could do this thing. One peculiar thing about the phenomena is the reaction of Tiggy, the watchdog, when anything happens. He capers around the yard, showing no supernatural fear or agitation, but every indication of joy. The old house has many rats, and squirrels live in the roof, but even they could not do some of the things that have happened. There are swallows in the chimney, but they never come into the attic. Altogether, it is a most remarkable daylight mystery. That concludes this episode of the Mysterious Manchester Murders. We really hope that you enjoyed the show. If you did enjoy the show, we would be really grateful if you could like and subscribe to our channel. The likes and subscriptions help to keep our small channel alive. Do be sure to check out our community posts on our channel page every Sunday, which will tell you what episodes are coming up the following week. And if you have a liking for the lighter side of Georgian, Victorian and Edwardian stories, check out our original sister channel, Chronicle of the Times. The link is on our channel page and below. Thank you again, everyone. See you next time. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles.